Hello, our presentation is called Are All Conservatives Created Equal? Predicting Voting Patterns with the Three-Factor Scale. I'm Amy Bohmann from Texas A&M University, San Antonio, and this is Crowson Turner from Texas Lutheran University. And we're going to start with our introduction. I'm going to hand it over to Carol.
Hi, Amy and I have been working together for several years on the division and differences between liberal and conservative voters and perspectives. This has been studied for many years because conservatism and its related right-wing authoritarianism stance have been correlated with a number of negative or difficult characteristics, including intolerance of ambiguity, ethnocentrism, dogmatism, resistance to change, and unfortunately justification for inequality as some of the core components. So in our current climate, things seem to be becoming more and more polarized. It used to be, as Knight in 1999 pointed out, that people could be influenced away from the views of their political party by other ideologies. But as the Pew Research Center has found, ideology and party are becoming synonymous, and people are steadfastly and doggedly adopting ideologies of their party, such that Crowson Brandes in 2017 found that voting patterns in the Trump and Clinton presidential election were correlated with social dominance orientation. So we were interested in creating a new scale, given that many of these existing scales that have been previously mentioned had outdated items and items that impacted face validity because they tipped off the participant as to what was being measured. Further reviews of existing research led us to propose that we could separate social conservatives from fiscal or economic conservatives, and that there might be another division where people who preferred more social control or social dominance were different than those who had a more generally authoritarian stance. And this would be partly because people differ in their desire for the level of change, or whether they're afraid of change, and how much control they need. Additionally, we thought that certain personality characteristics, socioeconomic status, and education would be variables influencing conservatism. So we developed the 20-item Multi-Faceted Conservatism Scale, hereafter called the MFCS, and it did indeed exhibit three factors: general authoritarianism, a social control, and a factor we labeled economic conservatism. They do appear to measure different aspects of adherence to particular party ideologies, especially with regard to economic conservatism, as you'll see later. Definitely attitudes towards social versus economically conservative policies differ. This particular scale demonstrates reliabilities on the three factors ranging from 0.79 to 0.93.
So in our current study, we were looking at voting patterns based on somebody's MFCS scores. So their scores on those three different factors. And we were looking at voting patterns on people of 5 different levels of conservatism. These were mock candidates, and Carol's going to tell you about them in just a few minutes. So what our hypotheses state is that participants would score highly. If they scored highly in the social control factor on the MFCS scale, they would choose the most conservative candidates when they would be telling you who they'd be likely to vote for, based on the descriptions, not on them labeled conservative. Those scoring highly on general authoritarianism would be choosing the slightly less moderate conservative candidates. And those scoring highly in economic conservatism would choose a moderate conservative candidate as opposed to a high conservative candidate. And those who score low on all the conservative factors will choose the least conservative candidates, which are more liberal overall. Now, this hypothesis number 3 was one of the reasons that we really wanted to do this MFCS scale. This economic conservatism factor has been fascinating to us because we see this as something that you may endorse even if you were not very conservative in other areas. So we wanted to definitely take a look at what this does to people's voting patterns. Okay, so we had 84 participants with a mean age of 24.6. They completed our survey. This included 8 Caucasians, 4 African Americans, 62 Latino, and 5 Asian or Pacific Islanders, in addition to 5 listed as others. And we had a mostly female sample, And the mean of our self-reported political status was 2.33, with 1 being very liberal, 5 being very conservative, which means that we did have, more of a liberal biased sample just based on the participants that we were able to recruit. So there were quite a few more, if you look at the number of participants, quite a few more in the liberal categories than there were in the conservative categories. This was a 5-point scale. So there were 2 liberal categories, 2 conservative categories, and the middle of the road. So they completed demographics. They completed the Multi-Faceted Conservatism Scale, the one that we are creating, and the 60-item Hexaco Personality Scale. They also rated their likelihood to vote for 5 hypothetical political candidates. So we had descriptions of these 5 political candidates that you're going to see in just a minute, that included policy information, that things that they agreed with, these candidates, and then they used those to choose who they were going to say they were likely to vote for. So subjects logged into SONA to enroll in the survey at one of the universities, or they were recruited from psychology courses in the other university. And the participants took the survey on Qualtrics. And I'm going to hand it over to Carol to talk about how we created those candidates.
So this was one of the fun elements of doing this study. We had the idea that we needed to predict voting patterns, but doing that with live candidates during live elections did not seem easy to control. So we had the idea that we would create mock candidates. And so we took 4 areas that came up commonly in discussions that different political candidates were being rated on: healthcare policies, social and economic policies, and environmental stances. And we used different online political commentaries about positions to determine the categories each candidate held and which statements we would sample from them to create our mock composites. And so then we created position statements in all areas for each candidate. And Amy, I believe there were 12 or 15 statements selected for each candidate. And when we labeled the candidates with alpha sequence 3 letters to avoid priming the subjects as to which category that they were looking at. So they had to do it strictly from the statements. So we had examples that I won't read directly to you, but you can see the very conservative candidate would not recognize gay marriage and civil unions, and would be opposed to wind and solar power as inferior. Moderately conservative would support fracking, but not in highly populated areas, and would have a mixed position on immigration, for example. And again, we had matching positions, statements across different positions, but we're just giving you a variety in this case. So the middle of the road candidate wanted some environmental regulation, but not new ones, and wanted government to help with small businesses, and that's 2 of the many statements. The moderately liberal candidate wanted to maintain affordable health care and had no opposition to public funding for abortion. And again, we found opposing positions in other candidates as well. And the very liberal candidate wanted a single-payer healthcare system and environmentally have the government ban paper and plastic products that weren't biodegradable.
Okay, so in our results, we found that hypothesis 1 was supported. We expected social control, people who scored highly in social control, to vote for moderately and very conservative candidates, and they did, according to the correlational analysis. We expected general authoritarianism to correlate significantly with likely to vote for the 2 conservative candidates, but we did not find support for that. However, we're going to see support in different areas for that later on. Economic conservatism did correlate significantly with likelihood to vote for our moderately conservative candidate, and this was what we expected to find, but not the very conservative candidate. So the very most conservative people didn't score the highest in economic conservatism. We've seen and these people then did not say that they were going to vote for the very conservative candidate, but they did significantly say they vote for the moderately conservative one. Social control did correlate negatively with likelihood to vote for moderately liberal candidate, and economic for very liberal candidate, and general authoritarianism for very liberal. So these 3 were all part of hypothesis 4, that the lower scores on all of the conservatism scales would correlate with wanting to vote for liberal candidates. So that did support hypothesis 4. And this right here is just showing you their self-reported political status. We asked people how liberal or conservative they said that they were. And we also correlated that with how likely they said they would vote for very liberal, moderately liberal, middle of the road, moderately conservative, very conservative candidates. And we did find that we got what we expected here. This was kind of like a manipulation check in a way, that we did see that people who said that they were very liberal were voting for liberal candidates. Those who said they were very conservative voting for conservative candidates. Okay, so we also did some regression analyses as an exploratory analysis. So we did a stepwise regression with the three conservatism factors that we've been talking about, also with income, age, and the hexago personality variable serving as predictors. And we used each of those 5 candidates as dependent variables and then did a regression for each of those. And we found that for the very conservative candidate, the only significant predictor in all of those was social control. And the overall ANOVA was significant, just that one factor that ended up remaining in the equation for the stepwise regression. For moderately conservative candidate, we found that both social control and economic conservatism did predict, who would vote for the moderately conservative candidate. So that was to be expected. For the middle of the road, the interesting thing is that the income is what predicted the likelihood to vote for the middle of the road candidate. Since this person is not necessarily liberal or conservative, using those conservative factors really may not predict, how that person is going to, how someone would vote for that kind of person, but income did predict that. And so social control also negatively predicted likelihood to vote for the moderately liberal candidate, and other predictors were not, no other predictors were significant. So the moderate liberal one, social control is negatively predicting that, which can be expected, since that was the opposite of saying that they would vote for the conservative candidate, as we saw earlier. And in the likelihood to vote for the very liberal candidate, general authoritarianism, economic conservatism, and age all negatively predicted that likelihood to vote for that person. And those first 2 can be predicted. The age was also not surprising. People who were younger voting for the liberal candidates. So, and then in our discussion and conclusion, our results are pretty promising. 3 of our 4 hypotheses are supported. Social control did predict the likelihood to vote for those who are very conservative, what we thought. Economic conservatism did predict voting for moderates on the conservative side rather than extreme. That's what we had planned to see as well. And general authoritarianism did not predict conservative voting, but was negatively associated with liberal voting, which is kind of interesting too. So future studies do need to recruit a more diverse sample. That's one of our limitations, that we didn't have a very diverse sample. For example, we need more male participants, more older participants, maybe those who are not students, and we would like to better predict those voting patterns in the future with that more diverse sample. So thank you very much.